Hello, everybody. Welcome to another roundtable discussion organized by the Economics and Public Policy Cluster. This time, we'll be talking about a widely contested topic, universal basic income. The Economic Survey of 2016-2017, one of the articles discussing UBI, says that it's premised on the idea that a just society needs to guarantee to each individual a minimum income which they can count on and which provides a necessary material foundation for a life with access to basic goods and a life of dignity. So while originally a more of an economic concept, it is widely couched in a lot of political debates and respectively philosophical debates. The three main aspects of UBI would include universality, unconditional, and agency. So essentially, these are the tenets that sort of guide what covers universal basic income and how it sort of separates from other and a lot of other social security measures that are taken by all countries across the world. And accordingly, it has a lot of appeal to all sorts of political ideas across the spectrum, starting from the left all the way through the right. Left naturally because of the ideas of redistributive justice, social justice, and all of that, and aspiring to a more equal society. The right because it gives people more of an agency. They have the choice to do a lot with the money that is being given to them on a monthly or a yearly basis. However, it is a widely contested topic for good reasons, and it's not a recent concept. It has been there for quite some time. In India, particularly, UPI as a concept goes back all the way to 1938 when Nehru, when heading the National Planning Committee, proposed the idea of UBI. It was brought back in 1962 by the same planning commission, and today in the recent elections that were held, the TMC manifesto had the universal basic income, and I think one of the articles mentioned about how some of the rates would be around 7,620 rupees per year, which in itself spurs a lot of debate. Who sets the level of UBI? Who does it go to? Should all people deserve it? And there's a lot to talk about. So this is what we're here to talk about today. And let me introduce you the panelists. I am Tejaswini. This is Wynnona. We have Wynnona, my co-cluster head, and the team. We can start with Aviral, Harsheen, Sushmita, and Garima. So hopefully we have a fruitful discussion, and let's start.
All right. So now that Tejaswini has given such a nice introduction, I was thinking if we could discuss the effects maybe of UBI on the people specifically. So let's just have a human-centric perspective in the beginning. Garima, would you like to intervene?
I feel UBI is a very a positive approach to begin with, and I see it because UBI will help us to eradicate one of the biggest problems that we're facing right now, that is poverty. It'll help to diminish the poverty line, and like we saw what happened in Iran when basic minimum income was implemented, there was a large number of people who had escaped the labor market. And saying so, it brings me to my next point, which is UBI will give people the freedom to choose their jobs. We know there are a lot of people who are stuck in their old jobs because they don't have the necessary educational qualification or the skills, or they could never afford to go to schools. And there are so many children who are forced into child labor. UBI will give an opportunity to such people to follow their passions, to go back to colleges, universities, and follow it and get a job that which they actually like. Also, it'll help the women who are stuck in abusive relationships, who are just there because they are financially dependent on their husbands, to become financially independent and start something of their own. They wouldn't have to be stuck always. They wouldn't have to be stuck in the relationship forever. Also, it'll also naturally eliminate the need for social security organizations that work with unemployment benefits or food stamps. But however, there are a lot of contentions that implementation of UBI might make people lazier, and they would spend their income on partying and alcohol. And eventually, if there ever comes a day when government cannot continue giving the minimum income, then people wouldn't have their skills to sustain their livelihood. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think you're right, because it has been backed by historical precedents, right? So I just like read a New Yorker article once which talked about its previous implementation, and the longest, and this is the oldest one I've heard of. If it was in 1795 in an English village called, um, it has a very weird name, Speenhamlin, right? And what happened was people were divided into this group called the idle poor, in which these poor people were not either willing to work, and so yeah, even if they were offered work, they weren't willing to. And what happened was, a lot of investment went into these people, but like you said, because of the loss of incentive, right, there was this persistent idleness. Also, Thomas Malthus, who was an economist of the previous century, he said that poverty subsidies allowed, couples to make families to sort of reproduce before they reached a stage in their jobs and their careers, um, that allowed having a family. So I think this is a very important consideration to have in mind, and it's about population growth, right? So also, Garima, you mentioned a very good point about domestic abuse. That if since it is obviously a system which goes to, it is a system of universal income. So like everyone is getting the income instead of every household. What this will do is it may alleviate women who are suffering from domestic abuse, who are trapped in toxic and traumatic situations. They may leave if they choose to. At least it gives the finances to do so. But I would say that at least in India, a majority of women, at least in semi-urban and rural um, places, I have observed, I'm only saying this from personal observation, that they do not have appropriate financial literacy to have the control of finances in their house, to really take charge of the money, even if the state gave it to them. So I hope I make my point clear there. Um, Anywho, another point that I'd like to add to your this whole thing about what the positive impact on people, I would say it will incentivize people to innovate, because to innovate you need to have, you don't need to um, sort of, to innovate you need the motivation to. And when people are acknowledged for even non-wage work, which is traditionally non-wage, let's say, what will happen is more people will choose to do the unconventional things. For example, I'll just take a very random example. We're all aware of a lot of people in the middle class or the lower middle class. Just a lot of people in India in general are they aspire for their kids to sort of grow up and go into the IITs and these prestigious institutions. And even though their children may not have complete interests in that particular field, they will still be forced to go there, and they have no personal choice in the matter, just because they know that they want to support their family with the good handsome package that they're going to get, right? So I would say that when these people are allowed to do what they want because they have the safety net of universal basic income, they'll definitely go and do something amazing and spark change. So yeah, um, also like to talk about the happiness quotient, because this is a very important topic in mental health studies, that it may improve the sort of, it may increase the happiness of people who are given the UBI. But to this point, I don't personally agree, because yes, I won't call it happiness. I will call it a sense of relief when people know where their next meal is coming from, right? It will ensure survival. It'll give them hope, and it will definitely do those things. It'll protect them from utter destitution. But I'm not sure if I can call this happiness long lasting. If anything, it'll be short lived, because in economics, I remember the first tenet that I studied was that human wants are unlimited. And what that means is over a period of time, maybe a few decades, as the standard of living of people will increase, and their definition of what a basic need is will also increase. Their expectations from the state and from the UBI funds may also increase. So we also, before going forward, an important consideration is to keep in mind what this basic need is and to provide for just that. So yeah, that'd be my contribution.
I just have a quick interruption to make, though, Harsheen. When you said that, it provides for, like, your wants kind of keep changing over time. I think just a subtle distinction between needs and wants might help you, because I think, like, the premise of UBI is also to provide for basic needs as opposed to wants. I mean, it can, like, UBI can be, a means to an end, but I don't think it's the end in itself. Which, I mean, as people, of course, we want different wants, and we have different, but then we also have certain needs that we need in order to survive. Only then can we kind of move on to wants. And I think it'll just be kind of helpful to draw the distinction between the two, because as far as I understand UBI, it's to help you sort of guarantee your needs, and then if you still have some amount of sort of passive income that UBI does guarantee you, it's called uncompensated benefit, as Arvind Subramanian once put it. Then I think you can kind of use that to transgress to wants. So I just want to put it out there.
Yeah, no, that is so helpful. Even in my personal life, by the way, to know what I need and what I want are very different things, because it sets unrealistic expectations. So thank you for clearing that out for me. But the deeper point that I'm trying to make here, Tejaswini, is that you know, giving people income solely because they are citizens of our country is like feeding a man a fish, right? But what I'm saying is let's teach them how to hunt fish, instead of feeding them fish. Why? Because I mean, yeah, I get it. It is a more arduous task. I'll give you that. But it is better for the long term perspective because it'll get them on their feet, right? Um, and so I also would like to add that the whole motivation of people in an American society, at least, is the idea that there is going to be upward social mobility, and that's what gives them that lasting sense of happiness that I'm at least talking about from a psychological point of view. There's so many rags to riches stories which attract immigrants, right? There are 47 million immigrants in the US, at least as of 2015, and these numbers, they speak for themselves. We want to create a society where people have the assurance that even if they're at the starting point right now, they can go to they can go really high up instead of the state cutting them up with what is called the robot tax. But of course, um, go ahead.
Um, yeah, sorry, Harsheen. I just wanted to interrupt. I don't think I agree with you there. I think you talked about how we need to teach people skills instead of giving them money, right? But I think that doesn't completely think of the context currently. There's a lot of unemployment, and a lot of the people unemployed do have skills, right? Yeah, that's, you can't say someone should remain unable to eat enough meals a day or have unable to have shelter because there aren't jobs available. I don't think skills is necessarily the solution. Also, you talked about social mobility, and I don't see why that has to be an argument against UBI, right? So I think in the beginning, Tejas, when you talked about how 7620 a year would be what UBI in India would be, that's between 20-25 rupees a day. I don't think anybody sitting down and saying, okay, this is what being rich is, right? If your goal is social mobility, 25 rupees a day isn't coming in the way of that. It's just making sure you have enough to eat, you have shelter, you have clothes, and you can continue to work towards social mobility. I believe, even I was thinking about that even in the context of the English town you spoke of. I don't know if necessarily that looked at was unemployment as high there. Were the people who are poor struggling as much, right? What did being poor mean then? Because you talked earlier about innovation and how UBI will work with innovation. And the idea that if you know where your next meal is going to come from, if you know you're not going to be homeless, if you pursue your idea, you will. And there has been a lot of research into how insurance actually results in more innovation and more growth, because when people are willing to go after their ideas, that does eventually translate into economic growth.
Right. No, I completely agree with that. But the point that I'm trying to make is when people know that there's going to be a fallback option, just like a simple example, just popped into my mind when we were applying to colleges, even though we had in mind that this is the dream school, dream school we want to go to, when the time of applications came and we had already gotten into a reasonably good school, okay, just to make us like go by, we got into that comfortable mindset and it didn't allow us to strive harder, right? So that's the place that I'm really coming from, is that there are lots of lessons to be learned in adversity. But I know this sounds completely insane and completely Republican, and I know that's not what I stand for. But what I'm trying to say is that this is a very complex debate, right? Because we are sort of put in a round table and asked to choose between mental health and economic growth, but that's not how the real world works, or that's not how we would want the real world to work, at least at the Center of New Economic Studies, where we all work. Um, we want a world, this new economy, which sort of takes mental health and then sustainability and then economic growth and GDP, takes them all together and sort of in tandem with each other. So I'd say that is the goal. But what
Um,
you said about just one last point. What you said about people will want to strive harder and things like that, I would say that this is where an economic concept called moral hazard comes in, and it is an idea that says that people start behaving more sort of irresponsibly when they have protection. Just a simple example of that: when the car seatbelts were invented, this is where the idea comes from. When car seatbelts were invented and people started using, yes, it protected people from accidents, but then more people started driving very rashly to run into accidents. So the accident rates increased, but accident deaths decrease. So that's where this whole concept comes from, and that's what I'm trying to say. That it will increase a culture of abuse, alcoholism, right, spendthriftiness, going into debt, and it'll promote those behaviors. But I know that it is a gray canvas. It's not all black and white. So why don't you go ahead and tell me some positive effects, as it were, on the economic from an economic point of view?
yeah, I'll definitely do that. But just before I do that, I wanted to I wanted to like mention that your example specifically also didn't include monetary benefits, right? Nobody, I realize indirectly a part of college is placement, but there's lots of other aspects to college, right? A big part of getting into a good college is bragging rights. And so there are other incentives than monetary. And even if you have UBI and you take monetary incentives out of the picture, humans still at the end of the day want to create, they want to have bragging rights, they want to put things out there. Bragging rights isn't the only incentive, but that's one I came up with. And yeah, so we were talking about effects that UBI has on the economy as a whole, and it has a lot of effects on society, but also has a lot of macro effects. So, for example, the healthcare system, there's a lot less burden on the healthcare system, right? So they found that in places where UBI was enacted, there were less hospital visits, there were less work-related injuries, because you weren't putting yourself in extremely dangerous situations just to make enough to make your next meal. There was lower psychiatric hospitalization because there's a lot of anxiety that comes from not having the means or not having your basic needs met. And so if you're able to get rid of some of that anxiety, there's obviously a lot of research on how poverty causes a lot of mental illnesses. So if you're able to get rid of all of those, there's less psychiatric hospitalization. And then finally, people have the money to not need to eat horrible food or not need to not eat meals, right? They can afford better nutrition, and that results in them having better immunity. So people aren't going to the hospital for things that would have been not been an issue if they had access to a good immunity and good nutrition. And then it also has a profound impact on education, because students don't need to drop out to go to do a to do a job, but they also don't need to not get an education for other reasons, right? They don't have to, for example, like raise siblings or sort of needs that their parents can't meet because they're working. And so it across I think across most examples where UBI was enacted, they saw that it improves school attendance and there's better grade because the children have more time to put into education, to put into learning. And in fact, in India, many beneficiaries spend their transfer on school supplies. So school enrollment increased by 12%, which is a pretty high number. In terms of the economy, and obviously, so healthcare and education are both um, spendings by the government, so that's reduced. But we also reduce spending on crime because, you know, as I was looking up UBI, I read this quote or this description that talked about how I'm not going to steal bread if I know I'm going to have food tomorrow. But if I might die of starvation tomorrow, then I'm definitely going to consider it, right? So many crimes are born out of desperation. And because you need to commit the crime to see, rich people are going to be commit the crime irrespective of UBI. That's not changing. But so many crimes are born out of desperation. And when you take away that desperation, the crime also reduces, right? So they did, I believe, Seattle, Denver, the study when UBI was enacted, the crime rate actually fell considerably. So it does cause a reduction in crime, but also economically, it's believed to result in an increase or growth in the GDP due to higher demand. So, you know, Thomas Piketty has this, his book talks about research on how a large part of the decline in GDP currently, especially in the US, because that's what the context of the book, is because the rich control more and more money and they aren't spending it, right? It's just sitting in their banks because, well, they have so much of it. And so as our inequality increases, the GDP or the demand actually drops. So when you redistribute this wealth, each people, especially of on the lower strata, will have more money to spend. And because they come from this kind of income level, they'll need to spend higher percentages of their money, and that's only going to fuel the economy and it's going to result in more demand.
That sounds very positive, and that sounds like a very optimistic view of the economy. But is it feasible? Is it possible?
Good question, because that's exactly what I was coming to. All of this would sound really great, and I wish it does. It does get implemented one day. But I think one of the first questions when you do talk about like implementing a UPI is its feasibility. I think one article was especially enlightening because it asks us to focus on feasibility and not cost. Because I mean, in terms of cost, if we had to go by the cost way, there are two articles. One which talks about how there'll be a 50% increase in the current federal outlays in the US if the total amount of the federal government spends between like 2 trillion to 4 trillion in social security schemes, and if we had to increase implement a UBI, that'll be like 10% of just last year's GDP, which is a lot. And in the Indian context, another article had argued that it is, sort of time to implement universal basic income in India. But then they said that if you give 1,200 per month to 150 crore Indians instead of all Indians, as would be suggested by the term universal, it would cost the government 21.6 lakh crores a year, which according to the author is a lot more feasible than I think an amount of lakh crores that we spend every year for 10,000s of different schemes, which the author believes we will be able to offset by implementing a UBI. Again, all of these kind of sound really great. However, I think the first thing we need to talk about is the political pressure. In the US alone, now it's a bipartisan sort of a culture, so that you have one side and the other side arguing for two completely different things. And because UBI has to be financed out of, it can sort of be financed by taxes. But this is where the rich people might have an issue, or like not just the rich people, anybody, any taxpayer in their right mind would probably have an issue with it, because they will be like, okay, why should we pay for something that we don't know what is going to be used for? While that's a valid question for a lot of the other things that's kind of going on already, it does hint at very important points about inefficiency and how these programs are going to turn out. Because a scheme like UBI is going to cost a lot, as we have seen, and in some smaller programs such as Manrega, smaller with respect to the cost that is used out of every year's GDP as a percentage of every year's GDP. It's still argued that, sort of, I mean, you have a lot of schemes with the right intentions. However, the delivery just never comes because it's a lot of bureaucratic mess and there's a lot of corruption. And then there is, the opportunity cost is just immense, because when elections are coming here in India, we have fantastic culture, a freebie culture, especially in Tamil Nadu. But really, the question is just how well has it fared, right? People promise all kinds of things to all kinds of people, and it helps gain them votes, but it's only a political gain. Economically, how well does it fare is a question that remains to be answered. Um, and that kind of eventually leads us to the question of what I think Harsheen had already hinted earlier, what, free cash versus free costs. Like, that's a popular debate that people need to consider, like what is the cost of giving people free cash versus just maybe providing skills, or like, sort of making sure, or coming up with UBI where you can sort of help people gain more skills in a particular industry. But that kind of comes back to your original debate of, well, UBI is premised on the lack of technological sort of jobs available today, or rather somebody else might come in and say that no, there is a lot more that is being offered on the side of technology, just people are not equipped to handle such kind of a change. So what do you do there? So really all of this kind of circles back to the debate of, there's just so many different contexts in which you can apply UBI. It's very different because when you consider the political culture, it changes how you're going to approach implementing a UBI. And then UBI is ultimately an intervention mechanism of sorts. And, the idea is really, ironically, how do you just sort of universalize a model of UBI? Because there's just people of all kinds, cultures of all kinds, and just different political environments. So I think while we are having this debate and it's interesting, we do really need to look at real life examples to kind of understand whether it has been applied in certain states or nations or economies, and really see how it has fared before kind of asking the deeper questions.
So the idea of basic income was for decades something of a policy fantasy, like we have discussed so far. But the last few years, we have seen it become much less outlandish, to the point where we now have many limited basic income programs running around the world. Perhaps a sort of a dry run for a broader embrace of policy in the coming years. So, with a few exceptions, Kenya, where a big experiment in UBI is underway, Iran, which has a nationwide unconditional cash transfer program, and Alaska, which gives an annual dividend to everyone in the state. Basic income programs are offering money to small groups of 100 to a few thousand people, and not the entire population. In other words, they offer a basic income program and not a universal basic income program. These small scale trials are sort of necessary because governments want to have a good sense of what the effects are before they start shelling out billions of trillions of dollars for such a program. So some 130 countries from Mexico to Uganda have instituted conditional cash transfers, which may require recipients to send their kids to school, for example, or go for a health checkup. But starting off with countries that are more advanced and are considered to be the West, let's start looking at US for starters. The US has tried few basic income programs, but most have been short-lived, small-scale trials. Like I said, Alaska was the exception. Since 1982, the state has given every citizen an annual check for just being alive, effectively wiping out extreme poverty. The money can range from $2,000 per person when oil prices are high and to $1,000 in cheaper gas years.
Wow, that's a lot of money. So where's the funding coming from for all of this?
So Alaska has been giving every woman, man, and child an annual check from its nest egg, the $66 billion permanent fund that it has. Now, Alaska deposits at least 25% of its mineral royalties from oil, mines, and its gas reserves into a fund annually. This money is in turn invested by the fund in domestic and global stocks, bonds, private equity, and more. And the interest earnings are then distributed to the citizens every September.
And how did that go over the results?
So the results for this particular program in Alaska, economists investigated whether the payment was leading to people working less, as is sort of the assumption with such programs. And they found that the dividend had no effect on employment overall. It apparently had an effect on fertility, encouraging families to have more kids. So we can also look at this result from the program as if countries are looking to increase their population rates, as now I think China is hoping to do. Maybe this is a way for them to go. Another sort of a positive result that they have was, or a mixed result, shall I say, was it had some unexpected effects on the state's politics. Now, what I mean by that is, in 2015, plunging oil prices created a major shortfall in the state's budget, because that's how they were funding this whole program. In response, then Governor Walker deviated from the initial formula for how they distributed the money to their people, and in doing so allowed the government to continue funding state services and ensured sustainability of the fund. But instead of delivering a $2,000 check, for that year they gave a $1,000 check. So in 2018, the Republican candidate for running for governor saw an opportunity. He declared that if he was elected to power, he would give every resident about $6,700 annually, compared to the $1,000 that they received the year before. What was the result? The Republican candidate won. What followed was basically a lot of cuts into the state budget, a lot of services getting underfunded because the Republicans candidate did not think long term as how he would acquire such huge funding. But that was a result of such a program in Alaska.
So that's very specific, right? That's just Alaska. What about other experiments across the US, maybe even other countries?
Yeah, so another long-term program was in North Carolina. Since 1997, revenue from a casino in tribal land has given every tribal member money, no strings attached. So every person gets between $4,000 to $6,000 per year. Now, economists found that it doesn't make them work less. It does lead to an improved education and mental health standards, and decreases addiction and crime as well. Currently more programs are happening as we speak. In California, in the midst of an 18-month experiment. It's giving $500 per month to about 100 people. The money comes from individual and foundational philanthropy, with the initial $1 million in funding coming from an economic security project. The first batch of data shows that the recipients are mostly spending money on food, clothing, and utility bills. And they're now in California. There are now more and more cities are planning to start a trial elsewhere as well.
I see. What about other countries, maybe? Like I said before.
So in 2017, the Finnish government decided to see what would happen if it chose 2,000 unemployed citizens at random and gave them a check of about $600 every month for 2 years. Now this experiment is over, and the results are still coming out every year of what was the impact on the citizens. But primarily, participants were first of all assured that they'd keep receiving money even if they got a job. As it turned out, the income didn't help them get jobs, but it did make them feel happier and less stressed. The individuals who received a basic income were no more likely to find work than those who didn't, according to the results of the first year of the experiment. The recipients also reported that they felt more trust towards other people and social institutions, from political parties to the police to the courts, than they had before they received the basic income. Finland ended this trial in 2018. But till now, we have talked about UBI experiments in advanced countries, but such experiments have also been conducted in developing countries as well. Sushmita would like to talk about some of those models.
Yes, I'll excuse myself. I'll switch off my video for better audio. Am I audible?
Yes, perfectly.
So I'll be discussing UBI experiments that have taken place in developing nations such as Iran, Kenya, and others. We'll also note here that most of the basic income projects that have been taken place in developing nations are funded by governments, but a few are funded by private donors. And we'll also observe the behavioral effects it seems to have on the recipients of these nations. Firstly, I'll talk about Iran. In 2011, Iran rolled out a nationwide unconditional cash transfer program to compensate for the phase out of subsidies on bread, water, electricity, heating, and fuel. The government gave out sizable monthly payments to each family, 29% of the median household income on average. The program was later dialed back as some Iranians came to believe it was disincentivizing people to work. Yet economists found that the program did not affect labor supply in any appreciable way. The program is still running, and it is the only such program in the world to run nationwide.
Which developing country has taken up the largest UBI experiment so far, according to Sushmita?
Yes. So like you also mentioned that about Kenya in brief. So I'll just elaborate a little on Kenya. So the largest and the longest UBI experiment in the world is taking place in Kenya, for sure, where the charity named Give Directly is making payments to more than 20,000 people spread out across 245 rural villages. As part of this randomized control trial, which started in 2016, recipients receive roughly 75 cents per adult per day, delivered monthly for 12 years. Some preliminary results will be available soon. In the meantime, we have already seen that in another Give Directly program in Kenya, cash transfers have stimulated the economy and benefited not only the recipients themselves, but also people in nearby villages. In Namibia, between 2008 and 2009, all residents below the age of 60 living in Ojdivero Omitara region of Namibia received a basic income that is $6.75 per person per month, no strings attached. Regardless of their socioeconomic status, funding came from private donors in Namibia and around the world. As a result, child malnutrition dropped and school enrollment rates went up, while poverty-related crime like theft fell, according to the reports from BIEN and the Center for Public Impact. However, a lack of alignment with the national government meant that the pilot project was never rolled out nationwide. In India, between 2011 and 2012, a pilot project in the state of Madhya Pradesh gave a basic income to about 6,000 Indians. The project, coordinated by the Self-Employed Women's Association and funded by UNICEF, included 2 studies. In the first study, every man and woman and child in 8 villages received a monthly payment, that is 200 rupees for adults and 100 rupees for each child, which was paid to the guardian. After 1 year, the payment increased to 300 and 150 rupees respectively. Meanwhile, 12 similar villages received no basic income, acting as a control group. In the second study, one tribal village received an income of 300 rupees per adult and 150 rupees per child for the entire trial. Another tribal village acted as a control. The results were receiving a basic income led to improved sanitation, nutrition, and school attendance. In 2011, following years of budget surpluses and under pressure to help poor and elderly people, Hong Kong also tried out a program called Scheme $6,000. All adults with a valid Hong Kong permanent identity card, some around 6 million people, were eligible to receive a one-time giveaway of $772 each. The public had a host of complaints about the program. For example, that administrative costs were eating up too much of the money that could go to citizens, and it only lasted 1 year. However, it was briefly revived in 2018 thanks to another budget surplus and a round of pressure to help the needy.
Sushmita, do you think, like I discovered in Finland, one of the results of Finnish UBI experiment was that the happiness level. Do you think UBI is also key to happiness in Asia as well?
Yes, I think so, because South Korea has conducted the largest UBI trial in Asia, and somewhat it has been successful. With around 12 million residents in I'm sorry if I pronounce it incorrectly, Gyeonggi province surrounds the nation's capital of Seoul and is the most populous province in South Korea. In 2018, Governor Lee Jae-myung started a youth basic income program with the goal of helping all 24 years old in the region figure out how they can contribute to society. At 24, most young South Koreans graduate from university and begin looking for employment. However, many need to take additional courses for internships to develop the skills or qualifications they need to get a job. There are 175,000 24 years old in Gyeonggi, and for 1 year, each receives the equivalent of $220 in locally negotiable currency per quarter via a credit card. Although the amount is small, the program is popular with young people and local businesses. Some young people said the money made them determined to quit their temporary jobs so that they could have more time to focus on self-improvement. Local small and medium-sized businesses have meanwhile seen a surge in sales, as young people can use the currency only within the province and not an international chains like McDonald's. In addition, the Institute analysis concluded that willingness to work among UBI beneficiaries has not waned as some had feared, and that recipients are happier. During the COVID-19 outbreak, the government gave each family a one-time subsidy equivalent to $800. Although these measures are not properly considered UBI, there is momentum behind unconditional income. A poll last year showed that UBI has gained the support of nearly half the South Korean population. And now one of the leading candidates in 2021 presidential election says he wants every South Korean to receive a basic income equivalent to about $430 every year. He aims to start a small and gradually increase the figure to 5 lakh won by bolstering taxes on land, carbon dioxide emissions for burning fossil fuels, and digital services.
May I intervene? Well, so this whole key to happiness thing sounds very amusing to me. It really is, because I mean, give me $1,000 a month for just existing, and that is the key to my happiness. So yeah, but yeah, as lucrative as it sounds, I know that there must exist some conceptual weaknesses, right? So could you shed some light on that? I know Tejaswini could add it.
Yeah. I mean, not just conceptually, actually, coming back to what I was saying earlier, I mean, I think what Aviral and Sushmita have been saying so far is just like it just attests to what I was saying, that, you know, there's just so many countries, diverse populations, diverse cultures, diverse political environments. So, you know, UBI is just, I mean, before you even think about trying to implement UBI, you have to take into account all of these factors, right? Which kind of goes back to the sort of the central debate, you know, where do you even start, right? Because all of these projects were mostly pilot. I mean, other than I think Alaska, which is having a pretty successful program, either you target certain, you know, a particular age group, you target particular gender, you target particular age gap, or it's a pilot project, or it's, you know, provided, or it's provided by private donors, which is highly interesting. It's something I didn't know before. But at the same time, it just kind of makes you question, okay, but what about the long-term solutions? These are all kind of time bound. But what about when, let's say, we do come, you know, to a place where AI takes over, or, you know, robotics takes over, or it just threatens the jobs of so many people? What then? And I think it just kind of wears into, I mean, that all of that kind of leads to this sort of central premise that you can only implement a UBI if you are willing to reciprocate in the first place, right? Because as a taxpayer, you have to convince me that my money is going to help out some people. I need to have some amount of guarantee that they will be willing to participate in the economy themselves. But ethically speaking, that's a completely whole different debate, right? Because it's kind of like, you know, why should I be paying for somebody? I mean, like, nobody's paying for me. Like, if I was in tomorrow, if I'm in their situation, then do I deserve it, right? If I have, I mean, Rawls would probably say that yes, if you have to kind of put yourself at the place of, you know, everybody, you have to put yourself in the place of the most disadvantaged in order for you to sort of come up with a public policy like UBI. And for him, it'll be probably very feasible. However, if you are one of the highest taxpayers, then you're like, you know, I have absolutely zero incentive to pay. There's that, right? And then secondly, if there's the huge opportunity cost of what happens if people simply don't use their money efficiently. We don't know that. Of course, Aviral and Sushmita have given us ample evidence to provide otherwise. But I'm sure that if you're trying to implement a scheme such as UBI on a national level, I think one of the first most important questions is, why do all sections of the people deserve the same amount of money? You know, because intuitively you would feel that one section probably deserves more money than, let's say, the richest section of the society. Nobody needs to have, you know, not all people need to have like $1,000 per month, for instance. So what happens then? And I think it's just kind of, you know, it just kind of all comes back to the central question of, you know, like, why should anyone sort of get anything for free, right? That's just a very sort of interesting philosophical, you know, tangent that you can veer into very easily, because, you know, then the concept of freedom comes, and, you know, I think that's just a perfect sort of venture into the whole appeal of the left towards right, because that's what the right says, right? If you do give me free money, then I will be in a better place to choose how I want to, you know, spend my money. That's what the right is all about, right? Individual choice and capitalism, premises to capitalism, this and that. But the left also, like, if I have free money, they will also be satisfied. So overall, it seems like there are lots of considerations to UPI, but there are also lots of cons. So, you know, it's we're just all left to answer, how does it
Yeah.
really fit on the political spectrum?
Right.
Yeah.
Very interesting, because I just like really started laughing when you talked about the ethical question of why anyone should ever get anything free. And that made me think, because I'm also inspired by Gandhi, is that not Gandhi, but just basic human rights. The fact that it's not ethical to have money in my locker when I'm watching someone pass away on a footpath. Like, how is that ethical? You know, if it's not ethical, I mean, of course, it's the primal instinct to have money or hoard money, whatever, but it's not ethical either. And thank you for setting up the point, the political context, right? Because eventually, and I think I learned it from Paul Krugman, forgive me if I'm wrong, because I read it all the time, that economics happens in a political context, right? Because, of course, because of the interdisciplinary nature of things, it always happens in a political context. So what we've seen is through research and through reports that UBI appeals to sort of all, it has a wide appeal across the political spectrum. But what may be the reasons, right? And so I just want to take a quick look at which section of the political spectrum what's in it for them, what is UBI offering to them. So when I'll just sort of start with liberal egalitarianism, maybe. So that is, you can equate that to sort of the Rawls principles of justice, which you talked about. So thanks for setting that up as well. So there may be some reasons, which is, first of all, non-demeaning welfare. What that means is when we're going for other government state welfare systems, what happens is there is a system of means testing to decide whether someone is poor enough or not to be maybe above the BPL, below the BPL, and all these other numerical indexes that we have, and I think that is a very demeaning thing to categorize a person like that, and that's what the liberal egalitarians would say. Then there's obviously the poverty elimination fact, which Garima has properly discussed. But then there is also the third thing, that is, people have a right to not work. Like I earlier talked about, they should be able to choose to not engage in non-waged kinds of activities and non-waged kinds of work. And the last two things, which I think which are also shared by libertarianism and other sections, I would say, is the empowerment which happens within households as well as within the workplace. Because when like Garima said, when there is domestic abuse, you can quit, you can leave the house. And when you do not like your job, maybe you're being harassed, maybe you are being sort of bullied in the workspace, or that's just simply not your passion, you always have the choice of simply quitting, knowing that you have safety net, like we talked about. Now, I'll just go on to talk about what libertarianism says about this. By the way, because this is a very jargonized term, what it means is basically the section of political people who believe in pre-political rights, basically natural rights. That is, just because you exist, you have right to property or things like that. So both left and right libertarians, they would say that it helps to promote, it brings the world closer to this goal of equal world ownership, which is basically land ownership in a way. So everyone has the right to land simply because they exist, and that should be equitable amongst the population. So that's what both the libertarians would say. But the right, they also add that, and this comes after a lot of research, it is that there are lots of problems in bureaucracy itself, and it's a gnarling bureaucracy. And the whole system of taking things in your own hands with $1,000 that you're given, at least in the US, $1,000 that you're given, you can do anything with it. That makes the process more efficient. All right. And coming on to the next topic, that is republicanism. And a key tenet of this philosophy, of this political philosophy, is these people from this philosophy, they believe in freedom from domination, right? Freedom from external constraints. And the second very important thing that we also notice in the American Republican Party is the civic virtues, the sense of community is, or at least giving back to the community if you've worked your way up, is very important. So Republicans also believe in non-demeaning welfare, and another aspect that's very important is community participation. And speaking of community participation, it's just the right way to enter Marxism. As we know, Marxism is a philosophy which ensures that there's not going to be poverty, and UBI helps in that. It also sort of ensures or proposes that there be equal power relations. So it does everything it can to sort of stabilize the power relations in a way, bringing them to the same level. And this will be achieved by the philosophy of non-demeaning welfare. So just handing people their $1,000, they have a right to it, they have a natural right to it. Yeah, that way Marxists would agree. And again, Marxists would also want to alleviate the poor people from from the effects of automation, for example, because the state considers its own responsibility to do so. And again, the community participation point that we talked about, it's all not, but all of it is not starry-eyed, right? There's a lot of criticism as well, but it's been discussed. I just want to talk about two things which have not been discussed, which are a bit outdated too, maybe in this context, but it's important that we cover them, and that is arguments against UBI from which have been received from the communism leaders. And the first one was by Karl Marx on the Spiegelman system, which we earlier talked about. He said that when you give people UBI, you're keeping the wages low, and that way multinationals, what they can do is I think that what multinationals can do right now is sort of decrease the minimum wage or decrease the standard of the minimum wage, because people have a universal income, right? They have what it takes. So I think multinationals could possibly slash the costs. That's a possibility. Then yeah, so this is the overall gist, I'd say, and we've talked about almost everything. But to conclude, I'd like to invite Garima. So Garima.
Yeah, so I think at the end, we can all agree that with automation and the advancement of AI, the need for UBI is reasonable. And UBI does have a lot of things to offer, at least theoretically, but we have a long way to go before it becomes a reality. While we have seen a lot of positive results in countries where UBI has been implemented, but there still remain certain loopholes or concerns that needs to be addressed in order to make this more effective. Overall, it was interesting to know all your perspectives and observations on this topic, and I'm sure we all gained a lot of insight from our talk today, and so did our viewers. So thank you all for joining, and to our viewers for watching.